My mom forced my sister into an eating disorder for fame and refused to see what was wrong with it, so I made her realize in the most extreme way possible. The video that destroyed my mother's public image began playing behind her while she was accepting an award for being an inspiring parent. At first, Mom kept smiling. She assumed the huge screen was showing the polished transformation montage her team had prepared. Then, the ballroom speakers played her real voice saying, "Don't eat before tomorrow's shoot. The camera notices everything." The next clip showed my 19-year-old sister Sophie swaying on her feet while Mom complained that Sophie had fainted before anyone started recording. By the time the screen displayed Mom's messages about turning Sophie's hospitalization into a sponsored recovery series, the applause had stopped. Mom grabbed the microphone and accused me of fabricating everything because I had always been jealous of Sophie. What she didn't know was that I hadn't chosen the final clip. Sophie had. She also didn't know that 3 people in that room already had the documents proving this wasn't an overprotective mother making a few mistakes. It was a business model, and my sister's illness was the product. My name is Emma. I'm 29, and Sophie is 10 years younger than I am. We grew up outside Portland with our mother, Diane. Our father left when I was 12 and Sophie was 2. He sent birthday cards for a few years, then slowly disappeared from our lives. After that, Mom built her identity around being the woman who had survived abandonment and raised 2 daughters alone. She worked hard, cleaned offices at night, and never let the electricity get shut off. For years, I admired her more than anyone. But Mom always needed other people to recognize her sacrifices. A private thank you never satisfied her. She wanted teachers to mention her devotion at school events. She wanted relatives to tell her she was strong. If one of us accomplished something, Mom found a way to make the story about what she had overcome to make it possible. Sophie was gentle, anxious, and desperate to avoid conflict. If Mom disliked her shirt, Sophie changed it. If Mom complained that Sophie was spending too much time with friends, Sophie canceled her plans. Mom called Sophie her easy child and described me as difficult. When I was 22, I moved 40 minutes away and began working as an insurance claims adjuster. The job wasn't glamorous, but I liked having a life that didn't need to be photographed. I still visited every Sunday, partly because I loved Sophie, and partly because leaving her alone with Mom made me feel guilty. Mom's online career started during the pandemic. She posted inexpensive meal ideas, cleaning routines, and stories about being a single mother. Her early videos were harmless. She was funny on camera, and people responded to her. Within a year, she had almost 80,000 followers. Then one video changed everything. Sophie was 16 at the time. She had gained some weight during remote schooling and mentioned that one of her dresses no longer fit. Mom filmed a video about helping her teenage daughter rebuild healthy habits with love. Sophie looked uncomfortable, but she smiled when Mom pointed the camera at her. That video received nearly 1 million views. Most of the comments praised Mom for caring about Sophie's health. A few people said it was cruel to discuss a teenager's body publicly, but Mom deleted those comments and called them haters. 2 weeks later, a meal preparation company offered her a small sponsorship. Mom told the family that this opportunity could pay for Sophie's college. Sophie agreed to appear in more videos because she believed she was helping. I didn't like it, but I accepted Sophie's explanation that she had chosen to participate. Looking back, that should have been my first warning. Sophie had technically said yes, but saying no to Mom never felt like a real option. The content became more focused on Sophie's appearance. Mom recorded shopping trips, exercise challenges, weekly progress updates, and emotional talks about confidence. She started calling them the Stronger Sophie series. At Sunday dinners, Mom rearranged Sophie's plate before taking photos. If Sophie reached for a second helping, Mom reminded her that followers expected an update in the morning. Mom said these things in a cheerful voice, as if public accountability were a gift. Once, Sophie reached for a piece of garlic bread, and Mom lightly slapped her hand away. Mom laughed and told me, "Relax, Emma." She asked me to keep her accountable. Sophie stared at her plate and said nothing. I spoke to Sophie privately that evening. I told her she didn't owe strangers access to her body. Sophie insisted that she felt better and liked earning money for college, but she wouldn't tell me how much Mom was paying her. The answer, I later discovered, was $500 a month. By the time Sophie turned 18, Mom's pages had more than 700,000 followers across several platforms. She had a manager, an editor, affiliate links, speaking invitations, and sponsorships from wellness companies. Some months, the business brought in more than $14,000. Mom controlled every account. Sophie postponed college because Mom said the brand needed consistency. Mom promised it would only be for 1 year and told everyone that Sophie was excited to work full-time as a content creator. Sophie told me a different version. She said Mom had warned her that leaving would destroy everything they had built and make 3 years of sacrifice meaningless. I told Sophie that sounded like manipulation. Sophie began crying and asked me not to confront Mom. She said she could handle 1 more year. That was the pattern for the next several months. I noticed something frightening. Sophie begged me not to interfere, and I convinced myself that respecting her wishes was the same as protecting her. Her hair began thinning. She was constantly cold, even in warm rooms. She stopped meeting friends because every meal made her anxious. If a restaurant didn't list enough nutritional information, she refused to go inside. At family gatherings, Mom praised Sophie's discipline while quietly monitoring what she ate. I asked Mom whether Sophie had seen a qualified doctor. Mom said their nutrition specialist checked the plan every week. When I asked for the specialist's name, Mom accused me of trying to undermine Sophie's progress. Mom looked me directly in the eye and said, "You only care now because she's successful. You've never been able to stand not being the important sister." That accusation worked because it contained just enough truth to hurt. When we were younger, I had resented how often Mom called Sophie sweet and called me selfish. I had sometimes pulled away from Sophie because I was angry at our mother. I spent several sleepless nights wondering whether my concern was really jealousy disguised as protection. Then Sophie fainted during a brand shoot. Mom told me it was dehydration caused by the hot lights. She posted a photo of Sophie resting on a couch and wrote that ambitious women sometimes needed reminders to slow down. The post included a link to an electrolyte powder. I drove to the house without calling first. Sophie was in bed with the curtains closed. Mom stood in the doorway and told me Sophie needed quiet, but I walked past her. Sophie looked gray. There was a bruise near her elbow where she had hit the floor. I told her I wanted to take her to urgent care. Sophie glanced at Mom before answering. Mom immediately said, "She already spoke to our specialist. She just needs fluids and rest." I asked Mom to leave the room. Mom refused until Sophie quietly said she wanted to speak to me alone. After Mom left, Sophie admitted that the specialist had never examined her. The woman provided general coaching through a company connected to one of Mom's sponsors. Sophie had not seen her regular doctor in almost a year because Mom worried the doctor would misunderstand their lifestyle. I told Sophie that I was taking her to a clinic. Sophie panicked. She said they had an important campaign filming the next morning, and Mom would lose the contract if she missed it. I wish I could say I picked her up and carried her to my car. I didn't. Sophie was an adult, terrified and still defending Mom. I stayed with her for several hours, brought her soup, and made her promise to schedule an appointment. Then I left. That decision still makes me ashamed. 3 weeks later, Sophie collapsed in the bathroom at home. This time, she hit her head hard enough that Mom had to call an ambulance. Mom filmed part of the paramedics arriving and later claimed she had recorded it because Sophie's followers would worry. I reached the hospital shortly after midnight. A doctor explained that Sophie was medically unstable and needed immediate specialized care. He was careful with his words, but nothing about the situation sounded mild. This wasn't stress, dehydration, or a bad week. Sophie had an eating disorder, and her condition had become dangerous. Mom's first question was whether Sophie could recover at home. The doctor said Sophie needed a treatment team. Mom then asked whether the paperwork had to use the words eating disorder because she was concerned that the label could follow Sophie online. The doctor stared at Mom for a moment before telling her that Sophie's public image was not the priority. Mom became offended. She said she had devoted years to improving Sophie's health and knew her daughter better than a doctor who had met her 20 minutes earlier. When Mom stepped into the hallway to answer her manager's call, Sophie grabbed my wrist. Her hand felt shockingly cold. Sophie whispered, "Please don't let her take me home." That was my breaking point. I told the nurse exactly what had been happening. I described the filming, the restrictions, the sponsorships, and Mom's control over Sophie's income. Because Sophie was an adult, the hospital staff asked her what she wanted. Sophie said she wanted Mom removed from the room and listed me as the person allowed to receive updates. Mom didn't scream when security asked her to leave. She became very calm, which was always worse. Mom told Sophie that fear was making her confused. Then Mom looked at me and said, "If you destroy her future, you will live with that for the rest of your life." Sophie entered an inpatient treatment program 2 days later. The facility restricted phone and social media access during the early stage of treatment. Mom interpreted that as an opportunity. She posted that Sophie had suffered a private medical emergency caused by exhaustion and online bullying. Without naming me, Mom referred to a resentful family member who had taken advantage of Sophie while she was vulnerable. She told followers that Sophie's wellness journey remained an inspiration and promised to share a recovery series when the time was right. The comments were filled with prayers for Mom. I wanted to respond immediately. Sophie's therapist advised me not to create a public fight while Sophie was stabilizing. Instead, I built a timeline using posts, messages, medical dates, invoices, and screenshots. I also reviewed the shared cloud folder Sophie had given me access to years earlier. It contained family photos, but it also held raw videos from the Stronger Sophie series. Mom assumed only her editor used the folder and never removed Sophie's access. The polished videos looked encouraging. The unedited footage did not. In one clip, Sophie said she felt dizzy and needed to sit down. Mom's voice from behind the camera told her to finish the sequence first. In another, Mom criticized Sophie for looking bloated after drinking water. There were dozens of moments that had been cut from the final uploads. Then I found the clip that made me physically sick. Sophie had fainted during the earlier brand shoot. The camera had continued recording after it tipped sideways. Sophie was visible on the floor while the photographer called for help. Mom could be heard saying, "Why didn't she tell us she felt bad? We didn't even get the full take." Mom's editor, Noah, had apparently marked the file "Do Not Use," but it remained in the archive. I contacted Noah and asked whether he would speak to me. At first, he refused because of a confidentiality agreement. I told him Sophie was in treatment and asked only whether the files had been altered. Noah called me 10 minutes later. He said he had quit 2 weeks before Sophie's hospitalization. He had become uncomfortable with Mom's instructions, but believed Sophie was following a legitimate medical program. Then Mom asked him to edit around a scene where Sophie begged to stop filming. Noah said that was when he realized something was wrong. Noah sent me copies of messages Mom had sent him. One said, "Keep the tired moment, but remove the part where she asks for food. Vulnerability performs well, complaining doesn't." Another message said, "Engagement drops whenever she looks too comfortable. We need the audience to feel like she's still fighting." That was when I realized this wasn't a misunderstanding. Mom had noticed that Sophie's struggle earned more attention than Sophie's improvement. Instead of protecting her, Mom had shaped the content around keeping her visibly unwell. But the worst discovery came from Sophie herself. During a supervised family session, Sophie told me Mom had emailed her revised meal instructions every Sunday. Mom always said the changes came from their nutrition specialist. Sophie had trusted them because the emails included the specialist's logo and formal notes. I contacted the company and asked them to confirm whether the instructions were authentic. Their attorney eventually responded that the coach had stopped working with Mom 8 months earlier and had never approved the documents I attached. Mom had copied the old format and changed the instructions herself. The company threatened legal action if we used its name publicly, but it confirmed in writing that the documents were not theirs. Sophie read that letter 3 times. Then she cried so hard the therapist ended the session early. Sophie had believed she was failing a medically approved plan. Whenever she became too weak to follow it, Mom told her that she lacked commitment. The shame kept Sophie compliant, and the fake professional approval kept her from questioning whether the plan was safe. I helped Sophie hire an employment attorney because the brand had used her image for years while paying her almost nothing. We did not file anything immediately. Her therapist was clear that recovery had to come before a legal war. First, I set a boundary with Mom. I sent one email stating that Sophie did not consent to new posts about her health, treatment, or image. I demanded that Mom stop promising a recovery series and preserve all business records. Mom replied that I had no authority over her company. She claimed Sophie had previously signed broad media releases and accused me of isolating Sophie for financial gain. The next morning, Mom posted a 13-minute video titled, "When Jealousy Tears a Family Apart." She cried while describing an unnamed older daughter who had always bullied her younger sister. She said this daughter was now exploiting a health crisis to seize control of the family business. People quickly found my personal accounts. Strangers called me abusive, jealous, and dangerous. Someone sent my employer an email claiming I had kidnapped my sister. My manager knew enough of the situation to disregard it, but I was terrified that Mom would reveal the treatment facility's location. That afternoon, I called Mom for our first direct confrontation. I told her I had the raw footage and confirmation that the nutrition documents were fake. Mom went silent for several seconds. Then she said the altered plans were only templates and insisted that every choice had been made for Sophie's benefit. Mom told me, "You don't understand the pressure I was under. Hundreds of thousands of people depended on us." I said those people were strangers and Sophie was her daughter. Mom answered, "Sophie wanted this until you taught her to call herself a victim." I warned Mom to stop posting about Sophie. Mom warned me that if I released private footage, she would sue me and make sure the public knew what kind of sister I had been growing up. She genuinely believed that threat would work. For most of my life, Mom had controlled me through guilt. She thought I would retreat as soon as she reminded me that I wasn't a perfect sister. Part of me wanted to retreat. I knew a public reveal would expose Sophie's most painful moments. Even with her permission, I worried that we would be repeating Mom's behavior by turning her illness into content. So I gave Mom one final private opportunity. Through our attorneys, we asked her to remove the posts about Sophie, announce that the Stronger Sophie program was not medical advice, release Sophie's unpaid earnings, and privately acknowledge that the nutrition documents had been altered. We did not demand a public confession about the eating disorder. Mom refused every condition. Instead, she announced that Sophie would join her at the National Everyday Wellness Awards 6 weeks later. Mom was scheduled to receive an award for Transformational Family Leadership at a sponsored conference in Seattle. She claimed Sophie would appear live to tell the truth about her recovery and expose the relative who had manipulated her. Sophie had never agreed to attend. Mom assumed Sophie would eventually surrender because Sophie always had before. When Sophie didn't respond, Mom emailed her a rehearsed speech and wrote that this was her last chance to save the brand that would pay for her future. That email changed Sophie. Until then, Sophie had mostly blamed herself. She still said Mom loved her and had simply become lost in the business. But after reading the speech, Sophie told her therapist that Mom cared more about restoring the story than repairing the relationship. Sophie decided she wanted to answer publicly, but on her own terms. We contacted the conference organizers. At first, they treated it as a private family dispute. Their director said they could not cancel an award based on accusations. We sent the hospital timeline, the fake nutrition documents, the company's confirmation, Mom's messages to Noah, and short excerpts from the raw footage. 3 days later, the director asked for a video call with Sophie. Sophie explained that she did not want her medical details announced. She wanted the audience to understand only 3 things. She had been pressured into content, professional approval had been fabricated, and Mom was still lying by claiming Sophie would appear. The organizers proposed quietly withdrawing the award. Sophie said Mom would claim jealous people had silenced her. Sophie asked them to let Mom take the stage. That was the extreme part of the plan. The conference would replace Mom's prepared montage with a 90-second video approved by Sophie and her therapist. The director would then announce that the award had been withdrawn after reviewing documented evidence. A representative from the main sponsor would be present, as would a journalist already covering influencer health claims. I asked Sophie 3 separate times whether she was certain. Sophie told me, "Mom made my body public for years. I want my refusal to be public once." Mom arrived at the conference believing she had won. She wore a white suit, brought a videographer, and told people Sophie was watching from a private location. I sat near the back with Noah and our Aunt Rachel, who had learned the truth only a week earlier. Mom saw me before the ceremony. She smiled and told her videographer to keep recording. Then Mom approached me and said, "I'm glad you came. Maybe hearing other people applaud will help you understand what you tried to destroy." I didn't answer. When Mom's name was called, she walked onto the stage to loud applause. She thanked the organization for recognizing mothers who refused to give up on their children. She said Sophie's transformation proved that love sometimes required making difficult choices. Then the screen turned on. The first clip showed Mom instructing Sophie not to eat before a shoot. The second showed the aftermath of the fainting incident. The third displayed the company's statement confirming that the revised nutrition instructions had not come from its employee. Mom stopped smiling and demanded that the technician turn off the screen. The conference director stepped onto the stage, but Mom grabbed the microphone first. Mom told the audience, "These clips were stolen and manipulated by my older daughter, who has spent her entire life resenting her sister." That was when Sophie's final clip began. Sophie appeared seated against a plain wall. She looked healthier than she had in months, but she was visibly nervous. Sophie stated her name, the date, and that she had recorded the message voluntarily with her treatment team's knowledge. Sophie said, "Emma did not manipulate me. She was the first person who believed me when I said I was afraid to go home. Mom, I am not appearing at this event because I did not agree to be part of your story again. You told people my hospitalization was caused by bullying. That was false. You told me a professional approved the instructions you sent me. That was also false. I am asking you, publicly and for the last time, to stop using my illness as your career." Nobody applauded when the video ended. The silence was far more powerful. The director announced that the award had been withdrawn and that the conference had suspended Mom from future events. The main sponsor confirmed later that afternoon that it was pausing its partnership pending review. Mom tried to continue speaking, but the microphone had been turned off. She pointed at me and shouted that I had humiliated her. The videographer lowered his camera. Security escorted Mom away after she refused to leave the stage. It was not a triumphant movie ending. My hands were shaking, and Sophie called me afterward in tears because the recording brought back memories she was still processing. But for the first time, Mom could not rewrite what had happened before everyone else heard the truth. The consequences unfolded slowly. 2 sponsors ended their contracts. Others simply stopped responding. Mom deleted several videos, then posted a statement saying she had made imperfect choices under enormous pressure. She never admitted fabricating the nutrition documents. Our attorney negotiated the transfer of a portion of the money earned from Sophie's content into an account Mom could not control. It was less than Sophie deserved, but enough to cover treatment and give her some independence. A separate employment claim is still unresolved. Some relatives accused me of destroying Mom's livelihood. Aunt Rachel supported us, but one uncle said family problems should never be taken onto a public stage. I reminded him that Mom had made the problem public years before Sophie or I responded. He still said I should have protected my mother from herself. Mom and I have not spoken in 8 months. She sends long emails every few weeks. Some are angry. Others say she forgives me and hopes I will eventually remember everything she sacrificed for us. She has never asked what Sophie needs for recovery. Sophie is living with me now and taking 2 classes at a community college. Recovery has not been simple or inspirational. There are difficult mornings, canceled plans, medical appointments, and days when she misses Mom so much that she questions everything. I have learned not to turn those moments into a lesson. I just sit with her. I also apologized for all the times I saw warning signs and allowed Sophie's fear of conflict to become my excuse for doing nothing. Sophie told me she wasn't ready to forgive every part of that yet. I told her she didn't have to. I still struggle with what we did at the conference. Mom had refused private solutions and was preparing to use Sophie's absence as proof that Sophie supported her. Exposing the evidence publicly stopped that lie in a way another email never could. But I also know public humiliation can become its own form of cruelty, even when the person being exposed caused real harm. Sometimes I wonder whether I chose the conference because it was the only effective option, or because some wounded part of me wanted Mom to feel as powerless as she had made Sophie feel. So, was I wrong for exposing my mother in front of her sponsors and supporters after she refused every private chance to stop? Or was making the truth public the only way to finally take my sister's story away from her?